The day the widow raised her hand at the auction, the town of Ash Creek forgot how to breathe, because nothing about that moment fit the rules people lived by, not the rules of grief, not the rules of decency, and certainly not the unspoken law that said a woman heavy with child should keep her eyes lowered and her voice quiet. Dust hung in the noon air like a held breath, sunlight glaring off the rough-hewn tables where men were being sold the way broken tools were sold, by weight of muscle and promise of survival, and she stood there in a faded, grey dress, stretched tight across her belly, one hand braced at her lower back, the other clutching a single silver dollar that had once been her husband's last coin. They called it a labor auction, a necessary thing after the war, after hunger and wounds and too many mouths to feed, but everyone knew it for what it was, desperation with a price tag. Men with bandaged arms, hollow eyes, and uniforms cut down into work clothes were lined up like livestock, their names replaced by numbers chalked onto a board behind them, and the crowd, farmers, shopkeepers, ranch hands, watched with the detached hunger of people who needed cheap strength more than they needed to sleep at night. She had not planned to come. Widows were supposed to stay home, to pray and endure, to accept charity when it was offered, and silence when it was not. But the baby inside her had shifted that morning, a sharp reminder that faith alone did not fill bellies, and when she heard that wounded soldiers would be auctioned for $1 a day, something cold and steady had settled in her chest. He was third from the end, the one no one wanted, slumped slightly to one side as if the ground leaned that way, his left arm bound tight against his body, his sleeve darkened with old blood that had soaked too deep to ever truly wash out. His hair was too long, his face too thin, and his eyes, God help her, his eyes were the kind that had seen too much and learned not to ask for mercy anymore. When the auctioneer called his number, the bids came half-hearted and cruel, jokes tossed instead of coins, men laughing about useless arms and mouths that couldn't pull their weight, and she felt the heat rise up her neck as if those words were aimed at her too, at the child she carried, at every night she'd lain awake wondering how long before grief turned into hunger. The auctioneer's voice faltered, already moving on, ready to drop the price to nothing. When she stepped forward, the boards creaking under her boots, every eye swinging toward her like the barrels of rifles. $1, she said, and it came out steadier than she felt. Laughter rippled through the crowd, surprised and sharp, a few men exchanging looks that said she'd finally lost her senses along with her husband, and the auctioneer blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Ma'am," he said gently, as if to a child, "you know this man's wounded." She held out the coin, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her fear, and nodded. "So am I," she replied, and the crowd fell quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when truth lands too close to the bone. The gavel came down, the sound loud as a gunshot, and just like that, the wounded soldier belonged to her, his future exchanged for a single silver dollar worn thin by years of use. He looked at her then, really looked, his gaze flicking to her belly, then to her face, as if trying to place her in a memory that wouldn't quite settle, and when he spoke, his voice was low, hoarse, meant only for her ears. "You don't know what you've done," he said, not unkindly. "I do," she answered, though she wasn't sure she did at all. They led him to her, cutting the rope that bound him to the table, and when he stood he swayed, catching himself with a sharp breath that made her wince. She reached out without thinking, steadying him, her hand warm against his sleeve, and for a moment the world narrowed to that single point of contact, to the shared understanding of people who had already lost too much to afford fear anymore. The crowd began to disperse, interest spent, already moving on to the next misery to be bargained over, and she turned to lead him away, every step heavy with the weight of judgment pressing into her back. The walk to her cabin felt longer than it ever had. The road winding through fields gone half wild since the war took the men, and never quite gave them back, and she could feel his eyes on her the entire way, not hungry or calculating, but searching, as if he were trying to read a story written in the lines of her shoulders. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of soap and wood smoke. The simple order of her life laid bare: a narrow bed, a small table, a cradle half-finished in the corner, where her husband's tools still rested, untouched since the day the telegram arrived. She offered him a chair, water, bread, all the small mercies she could afford, and he accepted with a gratitude that cut deeper than any refusal could have. When he finally sat, the strain of holding himself upright gone, she saw how pale he truly was, how each breath cost him something. "You can rest here," she said, setting the bread down. "In return, you'll help when you can. I won't ask more than you're able to give." He nodded, jaw tight, and for a while there was only the sound of him eating, the quiet scrape of crust against plate, the baby shifting inside her as if listening. She turned away then, suddenly aware of the tears burning behind her eyes, the grief she'd kept at bay cracking open under the simple kindness of sharing a meal. That was when she felt him behind her, close enough that she could sense his hesitation, his breath shallow and uneven. "Widow," he said softly, and the word carried a weight neither of them could ignore. She didn't turn. "My name is Clara," she replied. There was a pause, long enough for fear to take root, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper, raw with something that sounded like dread and relief tangled together. "Clara," he said, "there's something you need to know." She faced him then, heart pounding, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own terror, of a truth poised to shatter the fragile order she'd just built. He swallowed, glancing once more at the cradle, at the life waiting to begin, and leaned closer, his words meant for her alone. "I'm your husband's brother," he whispered, and in that instant the past surged back like a breaking wave, threatening to drown them both before either could speak again. The words he whispered did not fall into the room so much as they shattered it, and for a long moment Clara could not tell whether the roaring in her ears was the rush of blood or the sound of everything she had buried clawing its way back to the surface. Her husband's brother. The phrase echoed with cruel precision, dragging memories behind it. Two young men standing side by side on the church steps years ago, one smiling shyly as he took her hand, the other laughing louder, broader in the shoulders, already restless with the idea of leaving town to see a world larger than Ash Creek. She remembered how they had hugged the night before the war, how her husband had pressed a letter into her palm and said, half joking, "If I don't come back, you'll tell my brother he still owes me a drink." She had laughed then, angry at the joke, never imagining she would one day stand in a one-room cabin with that same brother bleeding and broken. Bought for $1 because no one else wanted him. "No," she said finally, the word tearing its way out of her throat, because if she said anything else she might scream. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected disbelief, as if he had rehearsed this moment on cold nights when pain kept him awake. "I didn't want you to know like this," he said. "I didn't want you to know at all." She took a step back, pressing a hand to her belly as the baby shifted, reacting to the sudden tension, and for a terrifying second she wondered if grief itself could hurt a child. "Why didn't you tell me at the auction?" she demanded, anger flaring bright enough to cut through the shock. "Why let me—" She stopped, the word "buy" sticking in her mouth like poison. "Because you wouldn't have raised your hand," he replied quietly, "and because I wasn't sure you'd recognize me. I didn't recognize myself." He turned his face slightly, and she saw the scar then, pale and jagged along his jaw, a wound she had never seen before, a mark the war had carved into him to make him a stranger even to his own blood. The room felt suddenly too small, the walls pressing in with every unasked question, every fear she hadn't dared give shape to. Her husband was dead, she had buried him, buried the future they'd planned together, but here stood a living piece of him, carrying his voice in the set of his mouth, his eyes in the way they softened when he looked at her belly. "What's your name?" she asked, needing something solid to hold on to. "Eli," he said. The name landed heavy and familiar, stirring old echoes of laughter at family dinners, of arguments between brothers that ended in crooked smiles. She sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted, and motioned for him to sit. When he hesitated, she surprised herself by reaching for his hand, the one not bound by bandages, grounding them both. "You're hurt," she said, practical instinct taking over where emotion threatened to overwhelm her. "You need rest." Over the next days, the cabin became a fragile truce between past and present. Eli healed slowly, his strength returning in uneven steps, and Clara learned to live with the weight of what he represented. They spoke of her husband in fragments at first, small stories, safe ones, but grief has a way of demanding honesty, and soon they were sharing the memories that cut deepest, the letter that had stopped coming, the night the telegram arrived, the guilt Eli carried for surviving when his brother had not. "He pushed me out of the way," Eli confessed one evening, staring into the fire. "Took the blast meant for me." The silence that followed was thick and sacred, and Clara wept then, not quietly but with the kind of sobs that empty you out, while Eli sat beside her, shoulders shaking, grief finally given permission to breathe. As weeks passed, Ash Creek noticed. People noticed the wounded soldier chopping wood one-handed, the widow standing a little taller, the cabin that no longer felt like a tomb. Whispers followed them down the road, judgments sharpened by ignorance, but Clara found she no longer cared. Survival had stripped her of the need for approval. When the baby came, it came hard and fast, a storm that left her broken and reborn all at once, and Eli was there, steady and terrified, holding her hand the way his brother once had, whispering encouragement with a voice thick with tears. The child's cry filled the cabin like a promise, and when Clara placed the newborn in Eli's arms, she saw her husband's smile reflected there, not as a ghost, but as a continuation. They named the child after him, a bridge between what was lost and what remained. In time, the town softened, as towns do when confronted with undeniable life. Eli stayed, not as something bought, but as family, and together they built something honest out of shared pain and stubborn hope. This is where their story rests, not in tragedy alone, but in the quiet courage of choosing to go on. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that even the most broken beginnings can lead to unexpected grace, then don't walk away just yet. Subscribe to the channel,